You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. And welcome to today's show. Today's show is entitled, My Cultural Narratives Jumped Over the Fence and Bit the Mail Carrier, but It's Not My Fault. I'll try and tease out what all of that means through the course of today's show. But there was a great revelation in the press. Yesterday, today, it's buzzing everywhere. Moussaoui, one of the 9/11 conspirators, has said that the Saudis funded Al-Qaeda. Well, stop the presses. Give us a new front page. Of course they did. This history is well known, as is the histories of the Saudi government funding insurgent Sunni groups throughout the Middle East for the last 60 years. This is not a revelation. But, of course, in the American press, it is for all kinds of reasons, because we don't know what the past was, because nobody bothered to tell us. And unless you dive into the histories in some arcane ways, it's unlikely you would just stumble across that the Saudis have actually been involved in funding the Wahhabis, the Sunni fundamentalist, backward-looking, violent group, since the 1940s anyway. The Saudis were likely controlling the 9/11 terrorists. The U.S. knew this. People disappeared just before 9/11, well-known Saudis in the U.S. Some of them were being tracked. Some of them were thought to be members of the Saudi intelligence service. And we have 32 pages of the 9/11 report, the official narrative of what happened. 32 pages covering Saudi Arabia were redacted and classified. 32 pages covering Saudi Arabia, our staunch ally in the Middle East. The truth must be kept from us. Why? So that the existing narratives of power and control and wealth can permeate culture and law and perception without distraction, and heaven forfend, without debate. This is important for us to have a unsullied view, an uncomplicated view of the world. And only in this way can we really be at peace with all of the strange events going on. But of course we're not, because the narratives and stories just don't work. They've jumped over the fence, and they're off barking at the neighbors and biting the mail carrier. But hey, it's not my fault, and neither are the other events that follow these narratives and stories. What I mean by narratives and stories are those tales that we tell, those elaborations of the explanations we have about the world, which are templates for how we think, for how we perceive, and for how we act, or the kinds of actions of which we approve. So if a country wants to go to war, it can't just arbitrarily jump up and declare war and go do it. It has to get the people somewhat on side, or at least where they're not being stroppy out in the streets and protesting. As long as they're going to their jobs and paying their taxes, everything is fine. Now, historically, narratives and stories have offered all kinds of explanations for the world. And these told people not only how the world worked, what was involved in the processes of the world, but also it taught them how to act. If you go back to Homer and look at Achilles, he is a model for how a Greek warrior was to act. And people would hear these stories and they would internalize them. And even Achilles learned from his stories that, again, were templates of how a warrior should act. So Achilles never has to scratch his head. He never has to think things through. He's never plagued by doubt, which is partly his strength and also partly his downfall. He never has to think it out. So he feels something in his thymus, he's moved to act, and he goes out and performs the actions. Now, not just the heroes, but also the explanations of the natural world were captured and transferred and shared through other narratives and stories. So, we have all these narratives of one or another hairy thunderer up in the skies, an angry Zeus who is hurling his thunderbolts from Mount Olympus. And we have more contemporary versions as well. We have, for instance, people running around, even as I speak, and getting a lot of press doing it, telling everyone that HIV/AIDS is punishment for homosexuality. It's the wrath of God. And we have people running around saying that a nation is strong because this or that deity smiles upon it, because the people have done the right things and kept the deity happy. Dare we entertain the thought that the Wahhabi are favored by their God? I mean, if this is true, they are certainly going from success to success. Just thought I'd throw that out. Well, these stories seek to explain and give meaning to events based on traditional beliefs and understandings hallowed by the culture. They seek to make cultures coherent. They seek to bring everybody to the same page so that everybody understands things in the same way. And this works really pretty well for small, relatively isolated cultures which have very little change across time. But as changes emerge, understanding and language start to fray this fabric of understanding, this fabric of taken for granted stories and tales from the past. The fabric phrase, fabric from the Old French, to make or create. Sometimes it refers to a building. The word reminds us that the fabric of culture is of a human construction. We made it. It's part brain wiring, some of which we share with the other great apes, and part of it's storytelling, which as far as we know is something great apes don't do. When change does come about, it comes with, or because of, clashes with other cultures that start impinging on it, and this can happen through migrations, this can happen for a variety of reasons, or it can happen with the rise of new or newly discovered or rediscovered ideas. And, sometimes these changes are actually pretty good things. We saw such a change in Florence in the 15th century when the Byzantine scholar Gemistus Plato arrived in Florence and explained a rather different idea of religion involving Jesus and Moses and Muhammad, and saying essentially this was at its end and philosophy was going to take its place. He was supported by Cosimo de' Medici, who sent people all over the known world trying to find ancient philosophical works and acquire copies of them. And within a few years, in Florence, they had recovered the works of Plato, of Plotinus, of Porphyry, and other plays and philosophers and histories that had been lost to Europe, and even esoteric texts like the Chaldean oracles, the Hermetica. People hadn't spoken Greek in Europe for centuries, and now they were speaking Greek again. Marsilio Ficino, was sponsored by Cosimo de' Medici to learn this language and to translate these new books into the Italian. And Ficino went on to create the new Platonic Academy in Florence. Now, what did all this change in Florence, that a bunch of books showed up and got translated and people started reading them? It caused this explosion of knowledge and creation and creativity and exploration that hadn't been seen since the Golden Age of Athens. Think of who all is running around Florence at this time. Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Michelangelo, Raphael, Brunelleschi, Ficino, Pico della Mirandola. There was this explosion that we look back on and we refer to as the Renaissance, the rebirth of culture, the rebirth of learning. And it broke out first in Florence, and then it broke out in other places around Italy, in Spain, in England, in Germany, parts of Germany even, just because people translated some books and brought some ideas in. Now, of course, the church, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church at the time, was not at all pleased with these new ideas and set about to eliminate them by any means necessary, and did a pretty good job of it. But the ideas remained, because once they get out, it's very hard to get rid of all of them. And so from this Renaissance grew the West of Western culture, grew our science, our art, our music, our philosophies, our governments, because a few piles of books read by a few hundreds of people changed the culture. And we can see other changes of a similar magnitude. Think about the change that the Royal Society brought to England when it was formed in the 17th century in London to promote exploration and knowledge, and they expressly excluded rhetoric and religion and philosophy. They wanted to focus on precise kinds of problems that could be resolved with a rational, experimental observation of the world. Empiricism. From this came the sciences. From this came the great rise in English manufacturing. From this came Wedgwood pottery. Josiah Wedgwood was one of the founders and early members of the Royal Society because he had some very practical problems. How do you measure the temperature of a kiln, for example? Nobody had a good answer to that, but they sorted it out. So cultures transform sometimes slowly, but almost inevitably this slow accumulation of new ideas, new ways of thinking, build and build and build until finally one day everything seems to change. Well, this is how it's worked usually in the past. But our narratives haven't magically transformed as much as they've run away. They've run over the fence, down the street, and the whole time they're barking and growling and often biting someone, because our narratives power. Our narratives give form, shape, and meaning to the culture that we inhabit, which is militaristic, which is invasive, which is aggressive, which is acquisitive, and wants more and more and more. Our culture is a culture with very short timelines. Our culture thinks in terms of electoral cycles, maybe 2 years, one of which will be spent campaigning, or annual fiscal reports of corporations, or earnings reports of corporations, 1 year, 6 months. The stock market is day to day, and many of our measures of how the culture is doing are day to day. And if one of them, like the stock market, slips, the whole of the culture is thrown into a tailspin. And our storytelling, our narratives, haven't been able to cope with the speed and the scope and the media which deliver our stories and narratives. Just hasn't been able to catch up. And it really doesn't want to, for a variety of reasons I'll get into in a minute. So as I was saying, the whole culture doesn't transform all at once, not in the beginning. And some parts of cultures continue to exist long after the other parts have died and gone to dogma heaven. These culture wars that we see on TV, the Alex Joneses, the Bill O'Reillys, the crazy people shouting at each other, these so-called culture wars are the funeral wailings of a culture that's not going away, it's gone. It's a sort of mourning for something that will not come back, however much you try to breathe life into it. It just can't happen. These are the last gasps of failed or outmoded or simply inaccurate ideas. Now, one of the reasons that we have the problem of keeping up with the world is the speed at which things change, or the speed at which we perceive change. It doesn't come in a daily newspaper once a month. It doesn't arrive by steamer and is posted downtown somewhere where we can all go read it. It's flashed everywhere instantaneously, the 24/7, 365 news system. We have this eternal present of breaking stories. Stories break and are replaced with new stories so quickly that we have no possibility of consideration, much less understanding. The streams of data, the streams of information can't bring back a historical past into the present for each point of the narrative. So take the Moussaoui story. Moussaoui says Saudis funded al-Qaeda. Well, we have to go back. We have to go back to Prince Faisal. We have to go back to the spread of Wahhabi through the known Muslim world, a spread funded and to a large extent directed by the Saudis. We have to quit having simplistic views that label everything. For instance, all of Islam. There was a huge split between the Taliban, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and al-Qaeda. It was an enormous split, just as we see splits all over the Middle East, sometimes along Shia-Sunni lines, sometimes not. But the narratives that we have don't include this story because we were spoon-fed. If we learned anything at all, we were spoon-fed stories about the simplicity of the Bedouin people and blah, blah, blah. And now the stories of the evil of Islam and the inherent wrongness of Islam as people try to fight these culture wars, as people try to perpetuate failed simplistic ideas, which they just can't do. You can't backtrack. The narrative's already moved on, and schools didn't teach us, and it wasn't on the evening news, and most people don't actually read books or set about to educate themselves on topics, partly because they're afraid of their own ignorance and finding how ignorant they are, and partly because they wouldn't know what to do with themselves if they couldn't hold on to their treasured beliefs. So the news ends up, the culture ends up, presenting stories that can't do justice to the complexity of the world. In short little bursts, in 27-minute news cycles, they just can't do it. It cannot happen. And there's no consensually accepted or available way that you and I and the rest of the folks in the country can kind of work out on our own what the stories are now, what the narratives are, what we should be saying, how we should be understanding things. That's part of the purpose of this show. But I'm one person. This is a small show in a small town, far from the centers of power, which may be a good thing. But we don't have this consensus. How are we going to put this together? How are we going to have these conversations? Where are we going to do it? On TV? TV's entertainment. Get over it. It's like sports. It's entertainment. It's not good for much else, not in its current forms. So where? In politics? Politics is pure theater. Generally always has been. I mean, Representative King from New York, Louis Gohmert, I mean, they're good for a laugh. Sarah Palin, who seems to have reached her sell-by date, they're good for a laugh, but this is not debate that informs things. This is just pandering to fears and concerns that people have that were put there by politicians and through the media. Now, historically, when we found ourselves in this place, when we didn't have the tools and techniques of understanding, when humans couldn't do that, people tended to come together in small groups, tribes, families, and whatnot, and they would allocate meaning to outside forces. Right? They had to have some way to explain these crazy things happening in the world. It's a system, not terribly unlike ours, except theirs was very local and ours is very global. So if they encountered things that were beyond human control, beyond human understanding, they would call those gods. And then they would then see the gods in the only way they could as somehow vaguely anthropomorphic, human-like. And they would put this frame on the gods, which would bring people into relationships with gods that were similar to the relationships that people had one to another. And these are generally reciprocity and propitiation. In other words, making them happy with something and knowing that there's a reciprocity, that if someone does you something good, you must do something back for them. The Navajo people, the ancient Hebrews, the fundamentalists, both Christian and Wahhabi, operate in a similar system, where in one form or another you find sacrifice, gifts, rituals, and all kinds of magical thinking. Magical thinking is believing in actions or causality in the world that is unjustifiable by reason or empirical evidence. It is not reasonable to suppose there is a hairy thunderer who inflicts plagues on people when people don't do what some ancient text says. And it's especially difficult to take such beliefs and bring them into a highly technologized, more or less advanced culture. They don't fit. So you end up with the anti-vaxxers going, it's God's wrath. You end up with people looking for all kinds of Looney Tunes explanations for natural events, and sometimes even confusing natural events with strange events, like that woman on YouTube who sees rainbows in her sprinkler and is concerned. I know I go back to her a lot, but it's such a wonderful example of what happens when we don't have larger cultural frames holding our thought together. So we've got that Reverend Jennings in Harlem, who is either a charlatan or he is so deeply sunken into magical thinking that he's lost touch with reality. Whether it's Starbucks polluting their coffee with, as he calls it, sodomite semen, or whether it's, the latest was, he had a revelation that homosexuals were going to start cannibalism for no good reason. But it's a magical thinking that somehow there are these demonic powers. And magical thinking often simplifies the world to easily understandable things. God demands XYZ. God doesn't get XYZ. God smites you with wrath. You don't remember rainbows and sprinklers. You already have a kind of vague paranoia, suspicion about the government and how the world works. So you start drawing connections that aren't really connections. We're looking for patterns. We're looking for meaning that we can put together. But these patterns are often flawed, and no meaning emerges from it. Malinowski, who wrote about taboos that linger yet as magical thinking. I mean, we still have some of these expressions in our language. Don't speak ill of the dead. Why not? They're dead. Well, they might come back and haunt you. We have the saying, speak of the devil. We usually leave off the last part, speak of the devil, and he soon appears. You invoke the devil by using his name. We have the practice that still remains vaguely of secret names, where everyone has a secret name that's known only in the tribe or the family. I mean, this was part of giving people a Christian name. This would be known among the group of believers. And if anyone learns your real name, they could do magic on it. Right? This is magical thinking. More magical thinking. People will commonly blame themselves for mishaps that happen to other ones. We will pray for safety and protection or rain or power to kill our enemies. And at some point, all of these prayers, these beliefs that doing the right thing in the right way, saying the right words with the right attitude brings about a desired outcome. It's like, if you put just the right English on the pinball table, the ball will light up all the bonuses. And these stories are bolstered by other stories, old stories, usually improbable, vastly exaggerated tales from some reimagined past of the tribe. I mean, think of Jericho. Joshua at the Battle of Jericho blew the horns, the walls came a-tumbling down. Jericho, by all archaeological evidence, didn't actually have anything in the way of walls, maybe a few cowsheds at the time the Hebrews were wandering around there. But it makes a great story. It makes a great story. And there's that wonderful sad moment in the book of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon, apparently, despairs that there is no justice, there is no magic. The race is not always to the swift, nor bread to the wise, nor victory to the strong, that it's chance. So, that's part of the problem. Part of the problem, too, is the media of delivery, which give us our news. The media comes from institutions, and institutions have changed. If anything, becoming even more closely aligned with power than they were in the past. Institutions always gravitate toward power. But we've seen this accelerate and cement. I'm going to mix my words there. But we've seen this accelerate and become more powerful in the recent past. There are no standards to tell the truth, to perform real journalism. Nothing you see very little you see in the New York Times, nothing you see on TV, very little of what we hear or read is actually journalism. So just at the moment when the stakes are high, when we most need good information, journalism absconds to the castles of power where it barks on cue and waits to have its belly scratched. John Pilger, the Australian journalist, who I have a lot of respect for, and you can find him on johnpilger.com. A lot of his articles will be there. Notes, the world is facing the prospect of a major war, perhaps nuclear war. with the United States clearly determined, I'm quoting Pilger now, clearly determined to isolate and provoke Russia and eventually China. This truth is being turned upside down and inside out by journalists, including those who promoted the lies that led to the bloodbath in Iraq in 2003. The times we live in, he writes, are so dangerous and so distorted in public perception that propaganda is no longer, as Edward Bernays called it, an invisible government. It is the government. It rules directly, without fear of contradiction, and its principal aim is the conquest of us, our sense of the world, our ability to separate truth from lies. We have a war by media, censorship by media, demonology by media, retribution by media, diversion by media, a surreal assembly line of obedient cliches and false assumptions. And he goes on to describe the current conditions, saying this is the most blatant, obvious, overwhelming display of propaganda he's ever witnessed in his life, and I agree with him there. It's certainly the most blatant I've ever realized. And I grew up in the Cold War. I grew up when the Russians were evil, robotic, soulless monsters who didn't love their children, as my mother used to tell me, until I read the poetry, especially the poetry written at the end of the Great Patriotic War. And I realized, gee, they're human beings too. But nobody was telling me that. Nobody was telling me that. If the journalists had done their jobs, and this is Pilger's argument, if journalists had done their jobs before Iraq, there wouldn't have been an Iraq war. If journalists were doing their jobs now, we wouldn't be involved in 130 plus countries and in the quagmire of the Middle East that we have created off of our own efforts. We wouldn't do it. In fact, a British senior official responsible for sanctions on Iraq, quoting Pilger again, a medieval siege that caused the deaths of 500,000 children under the age of 5. A guy named Carney Ross in the Foreign Office in London was known as Mr. Iraq. And he describes how it used to work back in the day. We would feed journalists factoids of sanitized intelligence, or we'd freeze them out. And what happened to the whistleblowers? They get airbrushed out. They get vilified. They get gotcha statements like, aren't you just an apologist for Saddam Hussein? Back to Pilger. The handmaids of suppression have done their job well. Consider the effects. In 2013, a poll found the majority of British public believed the casualty toll in Iraq was less than 10,000. A tiny fraction of the truth. A trail of blood goes from Iraq to London, has been scrubbed almost clean. But the big blackout that he sees is the one about Ukraine. And I've talked about this ad infinitum because it is an important story. Quoting again, John Pilger, the biggest Western military buildup in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe since World War II is blacked out. Washington's secret aid to Kiev and its neo-Nazi brigades responsible for war crimes against the population of eastern Ukraine is blacked out. Evidence that contradicts propaganda that Russia was responsible for the shooting down of a Malaysian airliner is blacked out. And again, supposedly liberal media are the censors, citing no facts, no evidence, One journalist identified a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine as the man who shot down the airliner. This man, he wrote, was known as the Demon. He was a scary man who frightened the journalist. That was the evidence. And the way we portray the enemy, of course, when we turn them into comic book figures, or as Pilger puts it, pantomime villains, which is what we've done with Putin. Right? He's just a pantomime villain, a sort of stand-up cardboard character who never says anything that we need to report or consider or talk about, which is nonsense, because if you listen to Putin's recent speeches, and especially if you listen to Foreign Minister Lavrov's recent speeches or read them in translation, the Russians have some remarkably articulate positions, and they're explaining a very different picture of the world than the one the U.S. has. You know, we've got General Breedlove from NATO, who Pilger compares to Stanley Kubrick's Jack D. Ripper in Dr. Strangelove. Quote, 40,000 Ruskies massing on the border, according to Breedlove. That was good enough for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Observer, the latter having previously distinguished itself with lies and fabrications that backed Blair's invasion of Iraq. If you wonder, wrote Robert Perry, how the world could stumble into World War III, much as it did into World War I a century ago, all you need do is look at the madness that has enveloped virtually the entire U.S. political media structure over Ukraine, where a false narrative of white hats versus black hats took hold early and has proved impervious to facts or reason. And there's a reason for this. I'm going to step away from Pilger here for a minute. Adam Curtis, the BBC documentarian I've talked about on the show before, notes that beginning with Reagan and Thatcher, the whole business of politics radically changed in the West, in that they quit promising to give us grand platforms, grand changes to transform society, to transform the world. And instead, they began to promise to protect us from evil, even, or perhaps especially, when this evil is of our own making. These politicians collapsed the narratives of a complex world into simple stories of good and evil. Good and evil, black and white. They fall back upon a history of old, culturally recognized ideas, allegories, metaphors, tropes familiar to everybody. And these tropes are inevitably connected to other tropes and stories, either national or religious. And it's funny, when you think about when you look up the word evil and look into the etymology, how the concept of evil evolved. It wasn't a supernatural force. In Old English, it tend to mean bad, vicious, or ill. The Oxford Dictionary says it was a comprehensive statement of disapproval, dislike, or disparagement. And in Anglo-Saxon, it meant bad, cruel, unskilled, defective, or if you used it as a noun, it would mean something like harm, crime, misfortune, disease, something like that. So, back to Pilger. Whole countries, he notes, are made to disappear. Saudi Arabia, quoting again, the source of extremism and Western-backed terror is not a story except when it drives down the price of oil. So, Moussaoui, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, comes out with this breathless revelation, and it's filling up the news pages. But Saudi Arabia doesn't exist except when it drives down the price of oil. Yemen has endured 12 years of American drone attacks. Who knows? Who cares? In one study, the University of West England did a 10-year examination of the BBC's coverage of Venezuela. There were 304 broadcast reports, 3 of which mentioned any positive policies introduced by the government of Hugo Chavez. The greatest literacy program in human history barely got mentioned. And now is this new demonization of Venezuela. Now things are getting interesting there. Now the powers are coming out and talking about how unstable it is. And golly, if only some smart people could get it together to get rid of these bad lefties, then everything would be okay again. But it won't. And they won't. And this is how it goes. Or talk about austerity. We have an austerity policy in the U.S., but it's even worse in Europe. It's worse in Britain. The Greeks have finally had enough of it. We'll see if the new government can actually pull off anything against the assembled might of the EU and Germany and the U.S. There was some early talk by the Greeks that they were courting the Russians as financial partners. Well, that seems to have disappeared. Whether it was real to begin with or not, I don't know. But if it were, you can bet the phone lines were burning up, telling them of the horrible things that would happen if they got in bed with the Russians. The horrible things would happen to them, of course. And now Spain, enormous demonstrations for parties supporting the death of austerity. So, go back to 2008. The economy crashes. A rotten system, a system absolutely corrupt at its core, was exposed, and everybody knew the big banks were crooks and they had betrayed us. Everybody knew that. And then the story changed. There's just a handful of bankers who are getting too much money. We got this austerity we've got to do because, money's tight. But the British government, the U.S. government, the German government, they're taking lots of money and they're giving it to banks. And none of this comes back to us. For us, we see pensions cut. We see benefits cut. We see hospitals closed or not built. We see a range of austerity measures that have to be taken so money can be given to the big banks, and we pay for it. Back to Pilger. Today, many of the premises of civilized life in Britain are being dismantled in order to pay back a fraudulent debt, the debt of crooks. The austerity cuts are said to be $83 billion. That's almost exactly the amount of tax avoided by the same banks and by corporations like Amazon and Rupert Murdoch's News UK. $83 billion. The amount of tax avoided by the banks and the corporations. So they don't need to gouge us. Corporations could just pay their damn taxes. They could just pay their taxes. Moreover, Pilger continues, the crooked banks are given an annual subsidy of £100 billion in free insurance and guarantees, a figure that would fund the entire National Health Service in Britain. I mean, we could have single-payer health care easily in the U.S., without the complexities of the Affordable Care Act, without the slipshod management of health care in this country, without every single health care office in the world having to hire a team of people who manage the insurance. We could eliminate all of that. next to nothing relative to the money the corporations get away with simply by not paying their bloody taxes. Pilger notes, quote, "The economic crisis is pure propaganda. Extreme policies now rule Britain, the United States, much of Europe, Canada, and Australia. Who is standing up for the majority? Who is telling their story? Who is keeping the record straight? Isn't that what journalists are meant to do?" Isn't that what journalists were meant to do? You know, even back in the 70s, it was revealed that some 400 journalists and news executives worked for the CIA. And these weren't obscure people. They were at the New York Times. They were at Time Magazine. They were in the TV networks. And the same was going on in Britain. But they don't even have to hire. The CIA, the NSA, the powers that be don't even have to hire journalists anymore because the journalists know who they work for. The journalists know they work for big money. The journalists know they work for big power. They know which side their bread is buttered on. And they know how to write stories that won't get them fired and that will remain unpublished. They know this. Nobody, and Pilger has a lovely comment here, nobody has to pay those who routinely smear Julian Assange. No one has to pay the Washington Post to accuse Edward Snowden of aiding terrorism. When the truth is replaced by silence, said Yevtushenko, the silence is a lie. Let me wrap up this Pilger piece. And I usually don't lean so much on one piece, but this is so aperçu. In the 18th century, Edmund Burke described the role of the press as a fourth estate, checking the powerful. Was that ever true? It certainly doesn't wash anymore. What we need is a fifth estate, a journalism that monitors, deconstructs, and counters propaganda, and teaches the young to be agents of people, not power. We need what the Russians called perestroika, an insurrection of subjugated knowledge. I would call it real journalism. It's 100 years since the First World War. Reporters then were rewarded and knighted for their silence and collusion. At the height of the slaughter, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George confided in C.P. Scott, editor of the Manchester Guardian, if people really knew the truth, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course, they don't know, and they can't know. It's time they knew. Well, maybe. Maybe it's time that they knew, but how is that going to happen? Because, there's no money to be made in this by the big media companies. And the big media companies are part and parcel of the government. So where is this change going to come from? I mean, where? Certainly not from the media. Certainly not from the governments. It's just not going to change. News agencies fail us incessantly. And this is part of the reason that they're dying. No one takes them seriously anymore as providers of news. And news can be received from many, many other sources. But this new habit of media reading, looking things up online, having your RSS feeds, looking at your Twitter feeds, whatever. These new media forms, this new habit of reading, can't form cultural narratives. It just can't do it. It can't form consensus if everybody's reading different things, and we have no forum in which to discuss it. The connectedness of the internet has reached the point where it's become entropic. It's entropy. It's noise. And power loves this, but it's really bad for people who want to build up discussions, conversations, such things. But we don't have that. We're all reading our own little bit off in our corners. So the current use of good and evil is us and them, or the U.S. and them. And we have our metaphors and exemplars of favor. We talk about the founding fathers, the freedom fighters, and we inevitably cast the other side, the evil people, as oppositional and irrational. Because in this formulation, evil is anything which thwarts the intentions of power. It's that simple. You want a definition of evil? That which thwarts the intentions of power. And the examples they use to conduct this demonization, of course, these are contrived and they're poorly formed, but they suffice for shutting down arguments which can't be had in a discourse of good and evil. Good and evil is a binary form. There are only two possible positions, and there's no room in between. There's no gray area. This is either or. This is the terrible simplifier. You're for us or you're with the terrorists. You support full-throatedly what we do, or you're evil and an enemy. And this breeds a kind of fear in people. And it's a fear that leads to another terrible thing, which is silence. Our institutions, such as journalism, all update to the new conditions of the world, some slower than others. But they don't update their goals and objectives. And they seem blind to the exponential growth of the possible damage that they can do. Power is intoxicating regardless of whether one may use it well or not. I have to think of The Sorcerer's Apprentice here, the piece by Goethe. And, of course, appearing in Fantasia, another work that Disney didn't have to pay any copyright on. But the Sorcerer's Apprentice, while the sorcerer is out, the apprentice gets out the magic book and does magic to get the brooms and the buckets to clean the house. But he can't stop it, and it grows and grows and grows and can't be stopped. This is the situation that corporations, governments are experiencing. They don't want to stop it yet. They don't even realize the extraordinary peril of the probability of their actions. They're building this NSA data site in Bluffdale, Utah. Exabytes or yottabytes of data only succeeds to make the haystack bigger. If you're looking for a needle in a haystack, hey, let's make the haystack bigger because that's a good idea. They're just changing the scale to a gigantic size. And in doing this, they seek to know the world. If only we have a little more information, a little more knowledge, we can have control. We will have understanding. Oh, this is ridiculous. They seek to keep pace with and monitor the history of a world that's already vanished. They seek to make predictions about a world that is based on statistics. Their basic thinking is unchanged. It's only more insulated from outcomes, and it's also insulated from objections. Austerity? Pay the rich first? This is theft. but we can't call it that, even if we do. And no one cares to change it. It's a kind of technicism, to use a phrase by the writer Manfred Stanley. He defined technicism as a state of mind that rests on an act of conceptual misuses, reflected in myriad linguistic ways of scientific and technological modes of reasoning. Conceptual misuses of scientific and technological modes of reasoning. This misuse results in the illegitimate extension of scientific and technological reasoning to the point of imperial dominance over all other interpretations of human experience. This is technology for us, and it dramatically alters our understanding of the world by becoming the object of the world and through assimilating language into its goals and values, and so transforming language. I'm not even sure what journalism should look like today. I'm not sure what appearance journalism would have if we actually had a new journalism. I'm not sure where we'll have the conversations that we so desperately need to have. And I can see no force on earth that will stop governments and media from creating false narratives, false truths, from promulgating lies and abuse and distortions on an almost unimaginable scale. Truly, it is as if our dog has broken out of the yard and has refused to hear our call. And it's rushing about the neighborhood, upsetting the neighbors, frightening the children, and attacking strangers without cause. I live day to day awaiting the wrath of the neighborhood. And that concludes today's show. I'd like to thank you for listening. This was My Cultural Narratives Jumped Over the Fence and Bit the Mail Carrier, but it's not my fault. The show has been Long Waves. You can follow me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio, and on that Facebook page, Long Waves Radio, you will find links to podcasts of the show as well as to articles. You can also send comments, suggestions, whatever. You can also write me by email. That's longwaves@kyrs.org. And I would say that the opinions expressed on this show are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. Thank you again so much for listening. You've been tuned to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Until next Wednesday, have a great week.